Hey, good morning, everyone. This is Kris Johnson. I was born and raised in the church, and I left at the age of 19. I'm a survivor, advocate, and also a volunteer with AFTT for almost a year now. My goal has consistently been to help educate the community and to help bridge and unify the divide on the topic of CSA. My abuser was my father, and the abuse occurred from around the age 7 to 19. Greg, do you want to tell us something about yourself?
Yeah, hi Chris. My name is Greg Swenson. I was born and raised going to the meetings and still attending. I had 14 years active in the ministry in what is called the work. And the last year I've been traveling and listening to people, supporting survivors, and advocating for necessary changes to prevent abuse and to move forward in a sustainable manner. So last August, I wrote a letter and communicated this to the fellowship, said that I would be taking a break to do these travels and have these conversations. It's now been over 8 months later and about 16,000 miles traveling around North America with hundreds of visits. And I'm really happy to have this visit with you today.
Yeah, that's really impressive. Can you tell me why you agreed to do this conversation today?
I feel like we're all on a journey and we didn't always understand the things that we do now. And one of the things that we have long talked about is the concept of repentance. And I have felt strongly like it's our opportunity, those in the church, it's an opportunity to practice repentance, and it's okay to admit to being wrong before and wanting to change and to do the right thing. So I felt like because of our story and how I came to know you and all the conversations we've had through this last year, that it would be great to share this with others and to encourage others down the same journey that I feel like has been really beneficial for me, certainly, and I believe for others as well.
Absolutely. I agree. Yeah, I was going to say our story definitely sends a unifying message, which I think we're in need of. And I believe others will be really inspired by hearing about your journey. So I'm really happy we were able to get on the call today. Um, and can you tell us what allowed you to approach this topic with an open mind, given that you have spent most of your life in the church and are still involved? Many others still appear resistant to acknowledging what has been going on in the church.
Yeah, I feel like my journey to this point has evolved over years. Of course, there's a lot of conditioning involved with growing up with a certain mindset, and some of that can be good, and as we've learned, some of that can be hurtful. Um, I have felt like, to some degree, I've had an open mind. I haven't been afraid of new information, but I've also not always been the one to seek out new or contradicting information if I've been satisfied with what I already know. So, one thing that probably opened my mind more to some of the concepts that we may touch on today is my own experience about 9 years ago when I had a struggle with chronic pain, and I began to understand that the mind body is very connected, and some of the things that I thought were just a physical problem or a mental struggle were also rooted in my view of life and my view of myself. And so this started me out on this trajectory of studying more about people who have been harmed or abused, adverse childhood experience, how that affects a person for the rest of their life. And this last year, when people began to speak much more openly in the church about their own adverse childhood experience, it was a topic that I had studied to some degree before, and it resonated with me a lot. I think many of these subjects haven't been talked about openly in the past. And so there is a resistance to acknowledge what is going on by some. There are also others who are opening up to this, because at some point in our understanding of life and concepts like faith and doctrine, we can have a tipping point where we are feeling one way, and then finally there's too much contradicting information and we can't put our head in the sand any longer.
Mm-hmm.
Kris, I want to ask you, because what you have embodied as a survivor and advocate is truly life-altering. So what was the process like for you to try to have a conversation with someone who unknowingly harmed you? And, other survivors have been through this process, and so have you with other people, and they've not had the same outcome.
Yeah. So in regards to the church, I feel that I was treated as an outcast for many years. And it was clear to me that there were conditions, both from the church and my family, around gaining love and acceptance. I knew early on that this was not right for me and not good for my well-being. I've heard stories that in order to remain in the church, one should be forgiving and sit across from their perpetrators in meetings with no repercussions for what they had done. And frankly, it's difficult for me to accept that some of the harm done to me and other survivors was done unknowingly. And also in my case, for example, there was a full confession on record.
Mm-hmm. And sadly, what you just shared with us is not unique. So many people have expressed a similar experience, and there hasn't been correct handling of perpetrators. People have been able to be in all kinds of settings in the church with access to children, and it's been a very ignorant response through a long, long time.
Absolutely. So my question for you is, what did the process look like of going from supporting my dad to realizing something was wrong, to reaching out to make it right? And how did you handle that emotionally? And when was the actual turning point for you?
Mm-hmm. This was within my first year of going to the Ohio staff, and I was in the field where your dad was, and I was around his sisters, which would be your aunts, and his mother, who was still living at that time. And I was with a coworker twice my age, who I was looking to for guidance in what we were doing and who we were with and who we were supporting. And so I fell very kind of naturally into this environment of a very supportive environment for your dad. And the way he was being framed, as I remember, was more like the victim. And the thing about your dad, as I recall, and had a number of interactions with him over a period of years, is that he was very kind, he was very hospitable, and he was very convincing. And so he checked all these boxes of the charismatic, convincing person that can be very dangerous as a perpetrator of sexual abuse. So I experienced this grooming process from your dad directly in his interactions with me and convincing me that he was a good person, and then with having others around me in the ministry who were supporting him, but not conveying the reality of what was really done to you and how that affected you. So I was around the family a fair bit, and they always spoke very positively about your father and negatively about you. So these are the dynamics of people that I was surrounded with that framed your dad as this good person. And then from a perspective of doctrine or custom in the church, there was this mindset that your dad was the one attending meetings, and so he was the one who was in. And you had, as you mentioned, left the church years before. And so you were out. And the implication of that essentially was that he mattered and you didn't.
Right. And what concerns me too is that there was no consideration for him potentially hurting other children beyond me. So, and I also, I mean, you're not the first person that I've heard that my father could be very charismatic, and also he always played the victim. So there was really no room for me in that space to be the victim for many years.
So at one point, several years ago, one of your father's sisters approached me and quite a number of people in the church, members, workers, asking if they would be willing to write a letter, a character reference of sorts, because there was an opportunity for your father to potentially be released from prison halfway through his 12-year sentence.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so strange to me now to think back on this mindset, but if I can give you a little insight, because your dad had always been framed to me as essentially the victim in this case, I felt sorry for him. Who he affected was not in my mind, but it was poor Dave. He might have to spend 6 more years in this environment that he really hates being in, and it's ungodly, and he wouldn't hurt anyone if he gets out, which I understand now goes very contradictory to proper education about how perpetrators can be, and that this is something that can stay with them for the rest of their lives. And so I felt in a way like I was doing the bold, honorable thing to support your dad and write a character reference, not defending what he did, but yes, saying positive things about him and ultimately contributing to this possibility that he could be released early. This was something that was kind of not on my radar much after that until a year ago, when all of this news started coming out about sexual abuse in the church. And many of us started to ask ourselves the question, what have I done to contribute to this problem? And I knew I wasn't a perpetrator of sexual abuse, but I immediately thought of this situation where I had written a letter in support of a perpetrator. And I felt condemned by that because I realized that I had only thought about the one who'd committed the offense, and I was not thinking about the one who was offended and thinking about how you would be feeling and how this support of your dad could be very harmful to you and could have wider implications on the safety of other people and other children.
Mm-hmm.
And so this was weighing on me that I needed to make this right. And I reached out to my former coworker who I was with at that time, and we were in support of your dad. And I said, I feel like we need to make this right. And so there was a somewhat of an attempt at that time to get contact information for you, and it was related to me that some messages were left with someone and the whole chain of communication broke down or whatnot. I'm not sure. But within a month of that time is when letters were posted online that included my letter that I had written. And people reached out to me and said, "Did you write this letter?" And they were surprised because already by this point I had become very much an advocate for the survivors.
Right.
My coworker and I had become very outspoken that this was not okay, and we were already jeopardizing our place in the ministry by speaking up in this manner. It was, of course, embarrassing to see that letter come out, but it was also kind of a relief because I realized, the one thing that I remember doing that I regretted as far as supporting a perpetrator of abuse has now come to light. And I really looked at it as my opportunity to show an example of what repentance could look like. I think if many in the church, and definitely many in the worker role would honestly reflect on their own experiences of how they've handled different cases, they would find one or several, or for some, it would be many situations that they didn't handle correctly and that there's a need for repentance from.
Mm-hmm.
And this was an opportunity to repent of that and reach out to this person named Kris. I actually did remember your name. I didn't remember how it was spelled, so that and I didn't have that contact information. One of the blessings that came out of the letter being posted is it was on Facebook, and then I saw the link to your profile, and I thought, now I know exactly how to contact Kris, and I'm going to reach out to him immediately. So I spent most of a day writing a letter and then reached out to you, and as I recall, said, can I send something to you? And you said yes. And I think you even sent had a heart emoji, which was super encouraging, because I thought, okay, he is open to some kind of contact, and I'm going to send him this letter. And that led to our conversation, right? I think you said, I'd like to follow up with a conversation with you. And a couple of days later, we talked on the phone for 2.5 hours.
Yeah, I don't want to give myself too much credit for the heart emoji, because I think I took you for someone else.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I was actually, I was not super receptive, but I will say, in the way you reached out was very respectful, and my intuition let you in. My initial thoughts about having conversation was more getting an inside because I had such a concern about what was happening within the church that I really just wanted to get information. Mm-hmm. And I thought I would take that opportunity to do that. Mm-hmm. And then I'm really glad that I did, because then, it's evolved into this great friendship.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you were open to that. And I feel super fortunate that you were open to that, because I could have fully expected a completely different response. And some would maybe be in that place where they wouldn't be able to have that open dialogue right from the start like you and I did. And I think a lot of it, from what I remember, even from that first phone call, is you had said that you had already been in a couple decades worth of therapy, and you had worked through so much that you could even sit in a conversation like that. Right.
And but in retrospect, I was still, I would say, somewhat closed off, because it took me back to a time when it felt like a lot of it could just be lip service, trying to save face. And so that's how I initially approached it. And then within a very short amount of time, you started producing action with your words, that's when I started to have, a different level of faith when it came to our relationship.
Mm-hmm. And that phone call was super helpful for me, more so than I was expecting, even when we started the call. And I ended up taking a bunch of notes. And right after that call, I put quite a number of bullet points into an email and sent it to nearly 50 workers across the country, including many that I had worked with before, and said, this is what can happen when you reach out to somebody that you had hurt in some manner before, even if you didn't realize what you were doing at the time. And I attached my letter that I had sent to you, which you had said that it was okay to share, and said I had this phone call, and these are all the helpful things that Kris shared with me. And I just was hoping that it would somehow encourage others to go through a similar process for their own matters that had come across their desk, or decisions that they had made that now that they would view differently with their current understanding. And so I felt moved to do that. I ultimately only heard back from 4 workers, I think 3 that are still in the work, and none of the leadership.
And Greg, can I ask you, since then, have people come around and reached out to you in follow up to those letters?
No.
Okay. Well, that's disappointing.
Mm.
I will tell you in my experience with the church in the past year, your name has been brought up in a very positive light, and it's they don't even know our story in many cases. So you're definitely, of course, I'm on one side, but I hear so much positive.
So, one thing I want to ask you is why do you think it's so hard for complicit people to change?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And in my experience, it's been that, some people are not receptive to new information or seem really hesitant to the truth. And for others who are willing to listen and believe all these courageous survivors that are coming forward, simply getting that acknowledgement is really a huge first step. So for some survivors, including myself, people have been blamed or called liars for so long that it's incredibly meaningful when someone does believe you.
Hmm.
And I think that ties into why it's so hard for people who have been complicit to change their complicity. And in many cases, complacency may create feelings of guilt. And I've experienced this, even within my own immediate family. So it's easier to stand your ground rather than to admit that to yourself in many cases, I think. So Greg, let me ask you this. How has this experience changed the way you approach allegations of sexual abuse now?
It's interesting because it's not been a totally new topic for us. And I think that's been a surprise to many people in the church who thought the workers or the church didn't really know about how to handle these things before, but now they do. And so now they're going to do differently. But the reality is, many of us in the US were doing the Ministry Safe program since 2010, which is practically my entire time in the work. I think that program has some benefit. I also think that it's very elementary compared with what somebody in the position of clergy or leadership needs to know about sexual abuse and abuse in general. One of the things that I feel I learned very clearly from that program was the need to report. And so that concept was always clear in my mind. But then there's all these other aspects of sexual abuse and child sexual abuse, like grooming. Ministry Safe did teach about grooming, but I was still groomed. One of the ones who was sitting in the first meeting that we had on this subject was also the one who accepted me into the work and was my first overseer, and his name is Leslie White. So essentially we had a master manipulator, groomer, and a very egregious abuser of women and minors who was in the room with us. And so here we're talking about grooming, and we have this groomer still grooming us. And so I feel like that led into then the experience that I had when I went to Ohio and met your dad. And it's like, okay, this concept of child sexual abuse is kind of almost like a theoretical thing. It's something that I have had some education on, but it wasn't reality when it came down to being groomed by somebody that was still casting themselves as a good person. So what I feel like has changed so significantly for me in the last year is how I now immediately think about the survivor, not the perpetrator. And that is a shift that doesn't, unfortunately, I can say from personal experience, doesn't always come naturally for people. If you're around a person who is physically in your presence and they seem very good and they seem kind and they're hospitable and they have these charismatic personality traits and they're even doing it under the guise of being spiritual, it's much easier to believe and like that person and not think about the survivor, the one who is unnamed or unseen, and in some cases is not even a part of the church. And so the thoughts of the person who's groomed goes toward the one who's the perpetrator instead of the survivor. And now my thought process is the inverse. I immediately am thinking about who has been hurt. And so a name of a perpetrator is released, and I think about this tragedy that probably not just one, but many, and we know it can range from the single digits into the hundreds and into the thousands for the most prolific perpetrators.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just wanted some clarification on the program that you had mentioned. Now, they were saying you should report to authorities, meaning the police, right?
Yes.
Because that doesn't seem to be followed through across the board. They seem to want to report to the workers, which don't seem to follow through. That's the trend that I've noticed. So it doesn't really seem that people are following that protocol.
Yeah, certainly for the much of the history of this fellowship and ministry, that has been the practice. And I think we know that many years ago in society that was commonplace. And then this group has been very slow to take on new education. And so, again, it wasn't until 2010 that this was being more broadly spoken in this region and other parts of North America. As far as I know, there were conversations being had about this. So maybe there was more reporting to authorities at that time, but certainly it was not handled correctly in many cases before that. To add something else about Ministry Safe, I feel like one of the big missteps that really came to light this last year is that this program or any kind of education about sexual abuse problems was in the past limited to the workers. And what really became obvious is the entire church needed to know about this, because there's so many people that could have the opportunity to call out bad behavior. And where's the accountability for the ministry if there's ones in that group who are covering? And as well as there's just many more eyes that can be aware of what's happening and can report improper behavior, can report to the police. And that wasn't happening. There was not this wider church-wide conversation until March of 2023.
Yeah, absolutely. See something, say something, and report to the proper authorities.
Yes.
Let me ask you another question. What obligation do you feel that the church owes to the people that have been harmed? And what can be done today to drive real change so that current members can be safe and protected?
Repentance. I feel like that's the start. And one of the things that has been really concerning to me and many others is it hasn't felt like there's been a true, vigorous repentance from top to bottom in the church. And that involves first recognizing the problem, naming the problem, speaking openly and honestly about the problem, and then being willing to do whatever it takes to change so that this problem is not perpetuated. And I feel like that is the obligation that the church owes to the people that have been harmed. And as far as the solution, there may be many things that need to be looked at. And what I have found is those who have been harmed are actually quite anxious to be a part of that conversation. So they're wanting to help. Ones like you who, it's actually mind-boggling to me, are not in the church, are not planning to be in the church, but have given untold hours this last year of reaching out and having conversations with people in the church because you want to see this be something safe, or at least to say that there would be safety for those who are the vulnerable. And this involves real changes. There is a need to have something in place, written, that states how these issues are going to be handled. The church has tried for most of its history to avoid that, having anything written down, because the leadership does not view it as an organization. But in reality, it operates as an organization. And so if that is the case, and these allegations of sexual abuse are just being handled person by person based on how they feel moved, sometimes with the words of, this is what the Spirit moved me to do, or this is how I feel about it, that has been very insufficient. That's why many of us have been saying we don't like policy, but we need policy, or written guidelines and whatever euphemistic language you want to use. But that's the reality. There needs to be a checklist of how these issues are going to be handled so that you can say it was looked into and this is how it was handled. And yes, it was reported to the authorities. And this is how, as far as the church is concerned, how the survivors are going to be supported. And this is how the perpetrator is going to be dealt with.
Yeah, and I think you have a much better understanding of trauma and how that should be dealt with in regards to the survivor as well.
Yes, it has to be a survivor-first approach. And through this last year, we continued to see a perpetrator-centric approach. I recently saw an email go out, and it was perpetrator-centric, and we need to be recognizing the survivors on an ongoing basis and continually providing opportunities for healing for them, and quite frankly, tangible solutions that are showing that this is not going to be repeated in the future.
Right. And I believe the church should be responsible for providing the resources that the survivor needs.
Yes.
Counseling. Yeah.
And I remember that was one of the things that you made really clear on that first phone call that we had, is you said, this is not cheap. And I think you had tallied up just the amount of out-of-pocket expenses that you had put into therapy for yourself.
Yeah. And I've learned more about that since that conversation, and it's a lot more expensive than I even imagined. Insurance was better in my 20s and 30s. So it is. It's really tough. It makes me appreciate AFTT and what they're doing even more than before.
Mm-hmm. And I've heard even just recently of some in leadership that feel that the friends, the members of the church, should not be involved in these matters of raising money, and would have even a more critical view of ones like AFTT who are outside of the church who are raising money for these causes. And the thought process seems to be that, well, God will take care of it, without understanding that it's through people, it's through humans that God takes care of people. We can't wait on just some magical event that somehow God is going to miraculously intervene with his own divine power in the absence of humans to right this problem that has been existing for many, many decades.
Right.
Kris, I find you to be a very forgiving person. In fact, I was amazed in that very first phone call I had with you that you even were willing to put it into words, like, I forgive you. I wasn't expecting that at all. So when you had the opportunity to consider your perpetrator for early release from prison, how did you determine that he was not, in fact, repentant?
So he was quite straightforward in his insincerity. He was claiming to be repentant and remorseful to the victim advocates, but was also saying something entirely different to his family members, who were then also reporting back to me. Early release should be a reward for someone who has truly changed. And when I realized he was still not being honest and truly owning up to his actions, then I didn't feel that early release was appropriate. When you offer forgiveness to someone who has betrayed you so badly, and then they go and they repeat the behavior or otherwise show that their apology wasn't genuine, it can start another cycle of trauma. So you have to be very careful.
Yeah, I recall you saying how significant that was to have a victim's advocate in the prison system.
That's right. And their job is to protect not only me, but the perpetrator or the inmate as well, because in many cases, the victim is angry and wants to go in and express their anger and potentially put them in a dangerous position.
Mm-hmm.
So they have to protect both sides.
Mm-hmm.
I had met with the victim advocates we had a couple of visits, amazing advocates. They came to my home and we had some lengthy discussions, and they quickly put a stop to that, and that they were concerned for my well-being.
Yeah, that's such a huge benefit, and I'm so glad you had that incredible tool available to you. And
Yes.
obviously, the others of us were not operating with that fuller picture. And so that's the danger of it, is we're just hearing this one side
Right.
that seems right and good in its own light without having this broader perspective that the victim's advocate was able to have, reviewing all these different avenues of communication with different people and seeing the incongruities in what
Right.
your father was saying.
Yeah. And that sort of brings me to the next question, which is, did you realize the difference between sheep and wolves?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's like I feel like many of us have talked us through this last year and realized the concept of wolves in sheep's clothing was something that we would read in the Bible, and we would think immediately about some person in another group, some outside of our church, that would be the wolf.
Mm-hmm.
So in my own experience, as I've reflected on this, I just feel like my ability to discern between wolves and sheep was effectively dulled from early on. And like I'm only now beginning to learn some of the signs. I mentioned before that I offered to go into this ministry to Leslie White, and I had no idea at that time what kind of a monster he was and all the
Right.
things that he had done, and a master manipulator. So we now know that he is a rapist and a serial abuser. And I was on that staff for my first year and a half. So then the Ministry Safe was initiated because of Leslie, but it really wasn't put in those clear terms to us. And there was very little said about even what Leslie had done, except all I remember hearing is that he had said some inappropriate comments. And what we can see now, as we look back at the timeline of events, is instead of Leslie being completely put out of the work at that time, based on all of the things that would have come to light in Illinois and previously in Colorado and prior to that in many other states, he was instead just demoted from being an overseer, and he was sent to Virginia, and he was placed with my last coworker, Jared, who was told nothing about him.
Wow.
So, some of these current church leaders who handled these issues in this manner are still leaders in the church,
Mm-hmm.
and were in my home a lot as a child. And so, again, this kind of, even outside of the actual act of being a perpetrator of sexual abuse, if we want to talk about complicity and covering, I have been around a lot of men who speak very nice words, can say very helpful spiritual thoughts, but I have also now learned through listening to a lot of survivors and a lot of current and former workers that there is an undeniable track record of minimizing and being dismissive of abuse.
Mm-hmm.
And there are many witnesses, and there's email evidence to support this. I feel like my inability to discern between sheep and wolves started very early on. And it's been only just recently that I've really been able to be more honest with myself and be in more honest conversations of saying, let's just look at the fruit. Let's stop just hearing what people are saying in the words, but let's look at the fruit. And is it good or is it bad? For me, so much in the work too, there was a kind of a messaging of just stay in your lane. Don't be an activist. And of course, what I've done this last year is very contrary to that. But I also feel very settled with the stance that I've taken because I feel like that is the testimony of Jesus, that he stood for
Right.
the vulnerable. And I'm very content with having that testimony and meeting my maker that way.
Yeah, my knowledge from the Bible, at least the letters in red, seem to prove Jesus was an activist.
Mm-hmm. Kris, I remember something that you had brought up a while back about the meaning of words and that thought of what are words and what is hypocrisy. And could you maybe share some of those thoughts with us?
Sure, and I might be piggybacking a little bit on what you just answered in the last question, because for me, hypocrisy is one who presents one way on the outside, but doesn't back it up with their actions. Growing up, words lost all meaning to me at a very young age, and I learned to stop listening to words. Uh, and just to sort of sum it up, my first real adult job, my boss required me to read the book Listening, the Forgotten Skill. So I started learning to listen at a much later age in my 20s.
Yeah. And like listening is, I feel like a skill that hasn't been widely taught, and especially in the sense of validating what's being said, not just hearing words and ignoring them, but having genuine curiosity to understand the meaning, the pain behind the words, and to be flexible to change based on the input that's being received.
Right, right. And I think there was a lot of confusion in my earlier years because we didn't exactly follow the doctrine every day. So that left us feeling, well, I'll speak for myself. It left me feeling very confused and shameful in many ways.
When you say doctrine, can you kind of explain what you mean by that?
Doctrine meaning, the rules that we were supposed to follow, the way we dress, the way we were, and I know that the doctrine has changed over the years in some regions where some people allow you to have television, but when I was younger, we were not supposed to watch television, but we had a television that we would watch. It would come and go. We would go from weeks of keeping our television, hidden away, and then we would bring it out and watch TV for weeks at a time. And I think that left me and my siblings confused what was right and what was wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this feeling to the need to present one thing in front of one group of people and something else in private.
Right, exactly. Can you tell me what the top things that you've learned this year? And have you learned anything from me?
Oh, wow. Yes, and yes. I mean, it's just been such a huge year of growth in that way. I'm so thankful and indebted to many who have been my teachers, including you. And I might just begin with that point that that's a very important thing that I learned fairly early on in this last year, is that God speaks through so many different people, and don't despise who can teach, who you can learn from because of who they are or where they are or what group they're in or whether they're in or out of the group that you're in and what their religious beliefs are, because we can learn from everyone.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like there has been a strong compulsion, a need to be right. The concept of righteousness, which arguably is something that Jesus was pointing out quite frequently, is that it's easy to want to have a righteousness that is not necessarily from God himself. And there can be so much emphasis being placed on being right, whatever we believe that to be, instead of truly loving. So truly loving means caring not just for people within a religious group, but also caring for those who are outside of that religious group. Another very important concept for me, I touched on it earlier, is the idea of recidivism. If it was taught or explained in some previous training session, that was not a point that was strong in my mind, that a person who has certain behaviors has a tendency to relapse into those same behaviors. And so in light of sexual abuse, we're talking about a perpetrator of sexual abuse is very likely to commit that same behavior and offend more and more people. This is like a disease, and this is something to be taken very seriously. Listening to somebody say that they are very sorry could be like listening to an alcoholic say, I'm very sorry, I don't want to do that anymore. And maybe in that moment they have that desire. But the merciful thing to do is to not allow them to be in those situations where they can continue to harm other people.
Right.
One of the really profound things that I learned from you, Kris, in that first phone call, and has stuck with me ever since, is survivors are not looking for money. I mean, I've actually still heard some people say this is a movement of attention seeking or money seeking people, that they're just wanting to attain those things from all of this unrest. And we know that's not true. And one of the things that you had said is what survivors are really concerned about. And I think, speaking from your perspective, but I know many others would share the same perspective, is they're concerned that another child is not sexually abused, another person is not abused in any way, and what steps are being taken to prevent abuse from happening.
Right.
There's a thought that just has been on my mind recently I'll share. We've heard a lot in our teaching over the years about submission and the need to submit, and there's some truth to that scripturally as far as being in submission to God's direction. But, I looked up the number of times that some variation of the word submit is in the New Testament, and it's only like 9 times. In fact, it's the same number of times that the word boldness appears. And I find that so interesting that there's been this disproportionately large emphasis on submission, which can quickly tip into this idea of submitting to other people and other people's ideas, not just to God. And really very little that's been said about boldness or courage, which were evidently very necessary, apparent concepts in the New Testament when people were being very bold. And so that's also helped me feel like, yes, this is what God wants. It's okay to be bold for the right reasons. It's okay to do that even if it puts a target on your back, because I have seen too many people hurt who can't even speak up. It's like they've lost their voice. The best they can hope for in life is just to pick up the pieces and get some semblance of life together in their little corner. And for many people, that kind of safe atmosphere involves a complete separation from the church. And I've felt more moved to use my voice on behalf of those, because we need to keep having this conversation.
Right.
Just to add one more thing, I'll say that a big topic and something that has been very important in my own understanding this last year is just to plainly say this group, this church, does not have exclusive right to the Spirit. And there has been an egregious mixing together of church and God as being on equal levels. And it's not a matter of that any person should be taking into their own hands or into the hands of a group and saying that salvation belongs to one group, because that's not what Jesus brought. And it's so much bigger than that. And now we've been bearing the fruit of that kind of mentality. And as we talk about this openly, it's an opportunity to move forward into really what is more scriptural. And that is that anyone can have a relationship with God.
Yeah. And you and I have had many conversations about that over the past year, which I found really interesting, because I think it can be dangerous to be part of this church and have that mindset. It almost feels like it could feed into some level of narcissism.
Yeah, it's hard to call out problems if you're trying to maintain the image of the only perfect way. So,
Right.
and it's really not a burden that Jesus was trying to put on anybody. And so, in view of this, I would really encourage people to think about it more deeply and consider that opening your mind to this does not take away from the joy. It actually increases your joy. It increases your love for other people. I've been in so many conversations with people the last number of months that say, I'm able to see people in a different light when I see them at the grocery store. I see people at work or school, and I look at people differently. Wow, that is profound. Like, that's the starting point where humans can be viewed as humans again, and not this idea of, well, they're worthy of help and care and love because they're in, but these other ones are not because they're out.
Yeah. Yeah. And to add on to what you were saying earlier, I have noticed a trend with many survivors where it gives them a peace to know that survivors have an easier path than they did. So I think that working with AFTT, helping provide these resources for victims, I think is part of the healing journey.
Yes, absolutely. Based on our earlier phone call, you had talked about this of your concepts of God and love being affected by your abuse and the church's treatment of you. Would you care to share anything about that and anything about your beliefs now?
Yeah, sure. So at an early age, I learned to associate religion with judgment and conditions, and that references to God or Jesus would usually be followed by something that to shame or blame me for who I am or what I had experienced. So in my 30s, I picked up a book at the airport, and it was Marianne Williamson's book, Return to Love. And it's a lot about inner peace and understanding love. Fantastic book. But when I first started reading it, within the first few chapters, it has many references to God and Jesus, which in my head, I had to replace, as I'm reading it, I'm replacing the words with higher power.
Mm.
And when I finished the book, I realized that it wasn't God or Jesus that were the real problem, but the way that they had been used that made them as a trigger for me. So in 2017, when so much evil was being revealed in the world, I started attending a Unitarian church where I was really moved to feel God's Spirit, I think, for the very first time. I've also noticed over the past year that I have felt closer to God when connecting with other advocates from this church. And also in many of our conversations. I remember when we met for lunch in California, I feel that God is love. And when I'm around that energy and I felt a mutual respect for people, regardless if they're in, out, leaving the church, wherever they are, I felt a great connection to God when we had the same level of spirit and compassion and connecting on that type of love.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're connecting and you want to help people, that to me, I felt like I've been in the presence of God. So that's really been beautiful.
Thank you for sharing that. I have felt the same thing that you're describing. Kris, what advice do you have for survivors? And then with regard to the church as a whole, what advice do you have for the church to support survivors?
Yeah, I suggest that survivors utilize the resources that AFTT are providing. I think it can be natural for survivors to be distrustful and perhaps resistant to getting help. My only regret is that I didn't seek it out sooner. So that said, I appreciate that everybody's on their own timetable and journey, and it's personal. But it's so important that the church members have a better understanding of what survivors are dealing with. So education, learning about trauma. So often the response is that it's in God's hands, similar to what you were saying earlier. And it's important that they know that their genuine love and compassion is so meaningful. My cousin always reminds me that we are God's hands and feet. So we all need to start doing the work. So Greg, tell me this. How does your life look different now going forward?
Yeah, well, it's going to look different. I just feel like somebody said recently several times, when you know better, you do better. And we know we have to learn from the past. And, maybe we did things a certain way and it seemed justifiable because it was working well. I can no longer say that about certain things. There are some things that I have really enjoyed, continue to enjoy with regard to the church, particularly what I see many people hanging on to as far as benefit is in the fellowship meetings and opportunities for fellowship. As far as what it means to minister, I think ministry is great, and having a calling to minister is wonderful and something that I've experienced. As we dig into the scripture and into the New Testament, we see that there really, after Jesus was resurrected, there was not a formula for that. So scripturally, ministering doesn't fit into a box. And many people who ministered in the New Testament, they were, yes, involved in works of teaching and evangelizing and pastoring. And those many also had jobs, and they had homes and spouses, and they didn't necessarily travel constantly their whole lives. And amazingly, these are new conversations for many of us in the church, but very important conversations. And so because of all of the information that I know now and conversations that I've been in with people, I have also had the opportunity to meet up with some of my have been coworkers of mine in other states and regions, and some who are a few that are very similarly aligned, that they could sit in this conversation that we're having right now very comfortably, and at this point are still being called to fill that same role that they've been doing. Personally, I'll tell you kind of where I land with this, Kris. With regard to sexual predators and just the nature of the way the ministry operates, yes, I believe that probably at this point, most of the actual predators of sexual abuse in the ministry have been called out thanks to people outside of our group, like AFTT, who set up a hotline for survivors to report to. But I came to where, going back to this conversation of how do we ensure that this is not happening again, I know for this system of ministry to continue in the same format, that new ones have to go into it. And the tradition is that they are staying in homes, including homes with children. And for myself, and maybe this is something that is my own burden, and so I don't want to project this on others, but for myself, I came to where I realized I could no longer in good conscience think of taking on, at some point, another young coworker and bringing them to dozens of homes with children and not knowing what their tendencies might be, knowing that there is no profile for a sexual predator. You know that they have that problem when the first victim comes forward. And that's a level of risk that is being taken on. And I think, again, the church needs to be asking themselves a question, is this necessary in 2024? The pure gospel can be shared without taking on that level of risk. So that means some changes of some kind. So I just felt more and more comfortable with the thought that, yes, that was my calling for a while. I'm thankful that I was able to use my voice in a positive way this last year and speak truth and advocate for those who are the vulnerable and maybe you don't have a voice. I, as some others have been feeling, don't feel like I, fit into that mold. And so, as you're aware, I've been dating the last number of months, and I'm planning to wrap up this missionary journey in July.
Mm.
I don't even know if I've told you this. I've enrolled in a distance learning program to finish my bachelor's degree.
No, that's great news.
It's just one of those realities of life. Some of us didn't do that before we went into the work, and, good box to check for getting employment. And I just don't feel like those things are going to take away from my opportunities to help people. And I've really been able to prove that in a kind of unique way this last year as I've traveled in sort of a quasi worker mode across the country, and not being sent by a particular man, very much praying for the Spirit's guidance. I also have realized that being financially independent from a certain format of ministry, and even having a significant other, has not hindered my ability to have conversations and to help others. And those things don't hinder our ability to have the Spirit. What hinders God's work is dishonesty. And so I love dwelling in this transparent space of telling people exactly where I've been, where I'm going, what I'm doing, and having even a recorded conversation like this, which I never would have imagined doing a year ago.
Mm-hmm. Well, I can speak for so many of us that we appreciate you as an ally for survivors and taking a stand, doing what's right this past year, and even the courage to take this call. So thank you.
Thank you, Kris, and all the same things to you. I think it's amazing the work that you've been doing, and your willingness to stand up and be an advocate so selflessly for so many people. I want to throw the same question back to you as well. That, what does your life look? How does it look different going forward?
Yeah. Thank you. Well, for me, I will continue to be an advocate in some capacity going forward. And I wanted to end with a quote from Dr. Glenn Patrick Doyle. Every trauma survivor working on recovery is also a rescuer. We're rescuing ourselves, past and present, from the pain and chaos we endured. And every time a survivor makes progress in recovery, no matter how loud or quiet we are about it, it strengthens other survivors' chances.
Thanks so much for your time today, Kris. I'm so glad we could do this, and I hope it's helpful, and people feel free to share this with anybody.
Thank you. Same. I appreciate your time.